Welcome to round 2 of the Nova Scotia Labor Day Open 2024. In this round, I was playing against another sort of 1400 level opponent, and I'm playing with the black pieces this time, so let's dive in. My opponent started with the English opening, and I typically against anything other than e4, I play the King's Indian Defense. And I've struggled against the English with the King's Indian Defense before, but we got the typical setup. E4 was played, and I played D6. And then in a recent game that I had analyzed, I found that playing C5 can be pretty strong for playing against the English. And then, eventually trying to expand on this side of the board. I had, in previous games, I had played E5 and then, put my knight out in front of this C pawn. The problem with E5, especially in this kind of position, is it allows white to have a very quick E4 whenever they want to. So maybe they get castled and they push that pawn so that this bishop is active, and then they can push F4 quite quickly. And so instead of committing E5, the other thing that I have done before is C5 and then later E5 anyway. But that also allows for an F4 break and potentially for this knight to come in. At least having the E pawn back means that if this knight comes in, I maybe have something I can do to kick it away, or something like that, depending on the context. So I decided I didn't really know any more theory beyond this, but I decided, all right, let's push the C pawn and try for an expansion on the queen side, and let's see what happens. I thought that maybe this would work. Let's find out. White castled, I played knight c6. h3, I guess just preventing my bishop from coming there. I don't think h3 was necessary, but that's okay. And I played rook b8. Maybe you could argue that rook b8 also wasn't necessary, but I feel like I've gotten burned enough times by this fianchetto'ed light squared bishop, especially since I do want to push these pawns, that I just wanted to get my rook off of that square, just so that I don't have to worry about anything happening there. D3, bishop D7, and now I've finished my development, and then white finishes their development, and this is where I needed to decide on my plan. Now, I've been saying all along that I think my plan is to expand on the queen side, and that is what I did in the end. But one thing I was worried about was this D4 pawn break, and I didn't quite know what to do about it. So as I mentioned, I didn't really want to play E5, and that's kind of a mistake in this position, because now I think the F4 push is probably quite strong, and if not right now, then it will be strong later. And then there are also potentially knight D5 ideas. So the problem that I'm worried about is if the D4 push happens, I just wasn't quite sure how to understand this sort of position. It looks like white is just getting really active, and even if I make this trade, then this bishop is contesting along this diagonal, maybe can even like trade off my dark squared bishop, which would weaken my king. And I just wasn't very happy with this potential position here. There's an interesting solution instead of a6, which I don't know that this really works in this position, but in some lines, this queen c8 move is actually kind of interesting. First of all, it attacks this pawn, and so white maybe has to deal with that. But then let's say that doesn't happen, and d4 is played. Now it's kind of interesting because after all of these trades, this c pawn is actually hanging, and so queen c8 is potentially an interesting idea. It's not one that I saw during the game or even afterward when I was analyzing it without the engine. It was like I said, I don't think it was in this exact position that I saw it, but in some line related to this, queen c8 is a pretty interesting idea. So maybe one to remember for the future in this kind of position. But I basically decided, all right, I don't know if the d4 push works for white or not. It feels a little bit scary, but I want to expand on the queen side, so let's just do it. Let's expand on the queen side. If white pushes d4, we'll figure it out. White didn't push d4, Instead, white pushed a4, trying to prevent me from pushing b5. And I decided, well, okay, that kind of, weakens this square for white. Why can't I just put my knight there? That seems like a good spot for my knight, right? I'm putting some pressure here, and I can't get kicked out. So that seemed like kind of a nice move, except I hadn't seen this option. I had seen, that the knight can't come here, because actually another nice thing about having the knight on b4 is I also cover d5 with the knight. But I didn't see knight a2, and then I thought for quite a while and calculated here, and just ended up going back, which I thought, that kind of wasn't nice. I figured that white would just, come back to c3, and I would be in this position again, trying to figure out what to do. It turns out that I can just take here. I think I was worried about taking here because I was seeing lines where if I push this pawn, then the a file gets opened up. And then if this queen moves, then potentially the rook can come here and white can pretty quickly get doubled up on the a file. But I think I was seeing ghosts. I don't think that actually works, at least not right away. And I could play in such a way that I try not to open the a file, and then this pawn is just kind of always in the way. And so this rook here on a2 just ends up being really passive. And so that's what I should have done, I think, is just made that trade and forced that rook to be passive. But instead, in this position, I moved back. And then, interestingly, so my opponent afterward, when we didn't really analyze the game together, but we talked about it a little bit, he was seeing some kind of tactic along this dark squared diagonal, and the engine doesn't say that there's anything here, but there was something that he was seeing that made him want to get his rook off of that diagonal. And now I was feeling pretty good because I feel like that knight is really misplaced on a2 since it's not trading off for my knight on b4. And so I went ahead with my expansion. We traded here and then traded again, and then I brought my queen. So this is kind of what I was going for. I wanted to open things up here and then start playing on this side of the board. The queen is now hitting this knight, forcing white to defend. White is offering a queen trade here, and it turns out I should have accepted, actually. There's a tactic here which I didn't see, which is to trade the queens, and then, what is it? To bring this knight to e5. And I'm hitting the e-pawn, and now it's really hard for black to defend the e-pawn. They can't, sorry, it's really hard for white to defend the e-pawn. White can't bring this knight back because then the rook hangs. And like maybe this knight can come back. Like I think white can defend this pawn, but it starts to get really awkward, and there's other things that I can do. Anyway, I didn't see that. And so where were we? Instead of trading the queens, I brought my queen here, maintaining this pressure. White brought this knight to have the knights defending themselves. And then, to be honest, I don't really remember what my thought process was here, other than it just felt like this was the right time to plant my knight there and open up my bishop, potentially. And if they trade, then I just trade a knight for a bishop, and white doesn't have any really clear compensation. My pawn structure, I guess, is a little bit damaged, but I can probably just push e5 at some point and have pretty strong pawns. So they did that. They traded and then brought their knight here, which was an interesting move that I didn't see. It forks the pawn and the queen. And what I did is brought the queen back here to defend my pawn. I was getting help analyzing this later, and my friend who was helping me analyze suggested probably bishop could just take here, and then after pawn takes, this pawn is really difficult to defend, and I can add attackers. I can add the queen, I can potentially get this knight over, I can double my rooks, and probably I can put a lot of pressure on this isolated b pawn. And of course, even if white takes with the rook, then I can trade the rooks and still make this isolated b pawn. And so that would have been an interesting way to do it, but I didn't see that, and I just didn't see any reason yet to be trading off that bishop. So I brought the queen back. White offered another queen trade. Obviously, they didn't want the queens on the board for some reason. And then I thought this was a nice move. I rotated the queen back over to the king side. So most of our attention had been on the queen side, but now I'm actually doing some interesting things on the king side. For one thing, I'm threatening to take that pawn, and so it more or less forces white to bring the king to defend. And then in this position, there's actually a tactic that I missed. I could have played knight g4 check. And this is kind of interesting because it moves the king around. I can potentially reroute the knight up to here and then maybe eventually to here if it's adequately defended. I did not see it, so I moved here thinking I would double my rooks. White did basically the same thing to mirror what I was doing. And then I saw this move. So I just did it one move later. And things were pretty interesting at this point. So white had to move the king. I started the knight reroute, which opens up the discovered attack on this pawn again. So white again has to move. So I'm adding pressure. I have sort of the initiative here. And then I did this bishop h6 move, which I think was good. What I wanted was... Well, what did I want? I wanted to put my knight here. No, not even that. I wanted to potentially put my knight here, which would potentially, trade for the bishop. But the more immediate move I was seeing was this queen move, queen e2, which attacks this pawn. So white has to do something about that. And then it potentially brings this knight check with white not actually being able to take back with the bishop because now the rook is under attack. And this rook also can't go here to defend this pawn because that hangs the rook. But the problem with this move was knight c1. At least this is the problem I was seeing, and I think the engine agrees. This hits the queen and also covers this pawn, and now there's not much that I can do. And so that's why in this position I played bishop h6, covering this with the idea of bringing my queen next. But the thing that I was worried about was, what if white just plays f3? Now this blocks out my queen, and I also can no longer put the knight here because the rook is defending. And I didn't quite figure out a good option, but I felt like in this position I could probably figure it out. It kind of removes all of these tactics, but maybe I would go back over to the queen side, double up my rooks, start figuring out what to do over here. At some point this trade is going to happen, and so on. White didn't play f3, they played f4, which when I was calculating, I didn't think that was quite as good, but the engine actually is also perfectly fine with f4. It doesn't block my queen, but it does block my bishop, and I potentially have to do something with the knight. But with f4 instead of f3, it allows for this check again, and then I can bring the knight over to this square, which is exactly what happened. And that felt like a really good outpost for the knight. Now, one thing I'll confess I really hadn't been seeing while all of this kingside stuff was going on is that this pawn is just totally hanging. I mean, it's not, because the knight can't actually take it because it's pinned to the queen. But once this queen moves somewhere, then this pawn is hanging and it makes this outpost not quite so good. But I felt like, okay, at any point, if this knight is in trouble, I should be able to just trade it off for that bishop. And I'll have the bishop pair in the endgame. Well, I already have the bishop pair in the endgame, but it'll just be two bishops for me against two knights for white. So a little bit of a shaky position, but I felt pretty good here. Let's see. The engine here says that, yeah, it's minus 3.5 or so. 3.9 if I let it go a little bit deeper. So the engine is pretty happy with black's position here. Now, this was an interesting moment. I decided I would just get the queen out of danger and pick up that pawn. Again, not really seeing that pawn was under pressure as well. But a move that I missed here was actually bishop takes. And then if pawn takes, then I actually don't take back with the queen, I take back with the knight. And now I'm threatening checkmate on h2. And so white's only option is to actually give up material to block checkmate for a move and then bring the queen to defend. And so this is totally winning for black. It's -6, -7. I did not see that bishop sacrifice, unfortunately. I wish I had have, but instead I played queen up here, white played here, and I traded queens because I didn't see much else that could happen. Like if I brought my queen back here, then there's this fork, and yeah, I just didn't see much else. So then I win this pawn, which I think I was thinking, you know, I'm so clever, I won that pawn, but of course this one is still hanging and I'm still not seeing it. White also evidently didn't see it right away because white actually gave me a move to potentially play this and maybe hold on to that pawn. Now this one is kind of weak, but it's defended currently, although not really, right? Because if, well, right now it is, but after my next move, it wouldn't have been. Sorry, where am I? If I played this, and then later I played this, then if takes, then I can't take with the rook because my other rook would be hanging. So anyway, it's a little bit unclear whether this move would have worked, but I didn't play it. I doubled up my rooks, never seeing that pawn was hanging, and then eventually white finally took it. So now we have equal material, but I feel like I'm pretty active. I have the bishop pair, and I could, at any point that I want to, unless white decides to move that bishop, I could trade my knight for the bishop, and it'll be 2 bishops against 2 knights, which I figure has to be winning for black. That's not necessarily true, but I felt pretty good about that option. And that's actually what I went for. So I actually traded both pairs of rooks, activated this bishop, and sort of forced this knight to be really passive. Now, both of those knights pretty much can't move at this point because if this knight moves, then I win that one. And if this knight moves, then I trade with a discovered attack and I win that one as well. And so I wanted to get some central space. White started moving their king up, and I wanted to activate my king as well. I decided this was the moment to trade because it kind of steals a tempo away from white. Like white has to move their king back. Analyzing this with a friend, he was saying, like, really, this knight is a lot better than this bishop, and so really I probably should have just left them on the board because this bishop is basically useless, right? All of white's pawns are on light squares, and this bishop is just horrible. So probably I should not have traded off this knight, but I did. Activated my king. White's king being here means that white can potentially push this pawn with pretty good effect because if I take, then I lose my bishop. Excuse me. It also means that potentially white has this check because if pawn takes, then bishop takes, or then king takes bishop, rather. So I guess I saw these things, but I calculated enough that I decided I was probably okay. And I just wanted to get active, trade things, like start pushing my pawns down the board. This was a mistake because it actually allows white to trade here and then deliver a check here with this knight and then get that knight out as well. And basically it removes this whole position that I had back here where neither of these knights could move. And so I didn't see that. Luckily, my opponent didn't either, but that was certainly a mistake that I need to learn from. Instead, white went ahead with the d4 push. And at this point, I felt like this was not the right moment for that push because I could actually capture on this side, moving the king away from the center. And then, yeah, and this, there was something interesting here, but I figured then I could just capture here, move that knight back, and now I get a passed pawn. And that's what happened. There was a defense here. What was it? Oh, yes. So after capturing here, white actually didn't have to capture that bishop right away. White could have pushed with a check. And then after I move my king, then capturing the bishop. And so the knight is still looking not very good on the edge of the board, but I didn't get my passed pawn. So lots of mistakes back and forth in this endgame. Lots of things to learn from. But in the end, this is the position we got. I had a passed pawn, and I figured I should be able to win this without too much trouble. Turns out, is this winning? Yes, this is winning for black, but it still some blunders were going to happen at this point. Activating the king, I got my bishop up here so that I could push because the knight is currently covering. So I went ahead and pushed. I saw that check, but I decided I was perfectly fine. I moved my bishop back because I just didn't want my bishop to get sort of chased too quickly. And white covered that square. And so I decided, all right, this passed pawn is just going to be sort of a constant menace, right? Like white can't do anything about it quite yet other than maybe try to attack it with that pawn, or with that knight, sorry, but in that case, I can probably just push. And so I pushed this pawn thinking, all right, let's make another passed pawn over on this side of the board. White did go ahead and attack here, and then I correctly evaluated here that I could push, and after takes, then takes. And that's exactly what happened. And now this is actually a really nice position where this knight basically can't move anywhere without me taking it with the bishop. And so we activated our kings a bit, brought the knight, and I again correctly evaluated that I can just trade here. And now it's a fox in the chicken coop scenario. So I'm going to make a passed pawn over on this side. And then when that passed pawn marches down the board and the king goes to stop it, I'm going to collect this one and promote. And basically that's what happened. I traded here, pushed this pawn down the board, and when white finally went to stop it, we got to this position. And then white played it out for a few more moves, but once I got here, white resigned. And so it was a pretty good game. I mean, it went pretty well. There were definitely some issues. I was happy with, let's see if I can find it again here. I was happy with how the middle game went, and especially how I was able to quickly swing from the queen side pressure over to gaining an initiative over on the king side. And it certainly didn't go perfectly, but I felt like I played pretty well. This would have been a really nice find. So that's definitely something to try to learn from, like what my thought process should have been here in order to find that move. And then I didn't exactly trade it down into a winning endgame, but I traded it down to an endgame that I think was practically winning at my level. I gained that tempo on the king. I locked down these knights so that they couldn't move, and managed to get this passed pawn and use it effectively to win the endgame. So pretty happy with that for round 2. And this means that I have 2 points out of 2 at this point going into round 3. And actually, round 3, for my first time ever, I got to play on board 2 of the tournament, which in these tournaments, we have 3 DGT boards, which sort of automatically stream online the moves and the position. So I got to play on one of those, which is my first time doing that in a classical tournament like this one. So round 3 coming up soon. Pretty happy with 2 wins. Let's see how the rest of the tournament goes. Of course, with 2 wins, you're going to be playing against someone who has 2 points or 1.5 points. And it is almost certainly going to be a harder game. And as you'll see in the next video, it was a much harder game, but a very good one that I'm quite happy with. So Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for round 3. See you next time.